So let's create a custom HTTP hook which handles all this data parsing, response status code checking, and state management logic, so that we just have a function, let's say, which we can call, which then sends a request and which then updates all its state behind the scenes automatically. For that, in the hooks folder, in our shared folder, I'll add a new file, and that is the http-hook.js file, which should have this HTTP hook I want to create. So in there, I will export a function, use HTTP client, sounds like a fitting name to me. And this function here will then, well, do all that stuff we do manually in each component behind the scenes for us. Now it should be named use something to fulfill this rule of hooks using use at the beginning. And we now need to import some things from React, of course. We'll definitely use state because we need to manage the loading and error state here so that in the components that use our custom hook, we got that state managed automatically. Now, what do we want to do inside of this use HTTP client hook? Now, I would say we certainly want to manage our loading and error state in there. So I want to copy that and move that into my HTTP hook. Then in here, I want to have a function, maybe we name it send request, because that is what I want to do there, which in the end should do just that. It should send a request. Now, of course, this function needs to be configurable. We need a URL there to which we want to send a request, the request method, which by default could be get, the request data, so the body, let's maybe name it body therefore, which by default will be null. Headers, which by default will be an empty object. Not null, but an empty object. That's important. And yeah, that looks good to me. Now, inside of send request, we can then call fetch and send it to a URL and pass this configuration object in. In this object, we want to set the method to the method key we're getting here, which is get by default, which is fine if we set it, but which could be post and so on. And I'll use the shortcut here where we don't write this, but let JavaScript expand this. We want to set the body and our headers. With this, we have a reusable function, which thus far only wraps fetch though, right? In the end, we just forward all the parameters here to fetch. So right now, we have no real benefit of using this. Well, for one, of course, this is an async function now. So let's use await here. And now we can do all that data extraction logic in here. So if we go back to the auth page, all that logic we're doing in here, where we get the response data and check the response status code, we can do that in here now. We extract the response data and then we throw an error if we have a 400-ish or 500-ish response code. So now we're doing this in our custom hook and in this function there as well. Now I will also wrap this now with try catch here, of course, inside of my hook, like this, so that in here I can set my error to error message if we got an error. I also want to manage the loading state here, of course. So here, before we try this, I will set isLoading to true, and I will set isLoading to false once we're done. Now, if we stay in the success case, so if we make it past this if check, I just want to return the response data so that the component which uses our hook and uses this function can handle the data, because we need the data in that component. So here I will return response data then. We could also manage some data state in here in the use HTTP client hook, but I don't want to do that. I just want to return it. Now this hook should return isLoading an error and send request so that the component where we use this hook has access to these pieces of information and to this function. So in the end here, at the end of my custom hook, I will return, let's say, an array or actually maybe an object. And there I want to return isLoading. And we could write isLoading like this, or again use the shortcut, return my error and the send request function. Now, one important note about send request, to avoid infinite loops, I will wrap it with use callback so that this function never gets recreated when the component that uses this hook re-renders. This function has no specific dependencies, so I add an empty array as a second argument to use callback. But now we ensure, well, that this function, as I said, never gets recreated, and we never have inefficient re-render cycles or infinite loops at worst. This can now be our HTTP client here. One additional thing I want to add here, though, is one other function inside of my hook, the, let's say, clear error function, which will call set error and set this to null. And I want to expose that as well here in the object I return, so that the components which use my hook also can call this function. And now there is one last piece I want to add to this hook, which we didn't really take care about before. What if a request is on its way and we then switch the page? Then we would get an error, right? If I save this, for example, here, I don't use the hook yet, but we have our other logic, and there the same problem applies. And now here, I go to all users and authenticate, then enter my data here, and press this and go back immediately. If I would do this super fast, and unfortunately here it loads too fast, then we might get an error because we're trying to update our state on a component that's not on the screen anymore. In such a case, I actually want to cancel my ongoing HTTP request. To do that, I will create a new constant here in the custom hook, active HTTP requests, which is an array, and which actually is not an array like this, but instead I'll use the useRef hook, which is built into React, to turn this into a reference. A reference here in the end is just a piece of data which will not change, or in this case, which will not be reinitialized when this function runs again. And this function does run again whenever the component which uses this hook re-renders. So now this will basically store data across re-render cycles, you could say. So I got active HTTP requests here, and I want to add an active HTTP request once we send a request. So effectively here, right after I set is loading to true, so before I send my request, I will create a HTTP abort controller with new abort controller. This is an API supported in modern browsers, and I will add this to my active HTTP requests. So here to .current, useRef always wraps the data you store in it in an object which has a current property. So this current property holds this array, which doesn't change across re-render cycles. To this, I will push the abort controller. I'm not managing this as state. For a state, React would also manage it to survive re-render cycles, because I don't want to update the UI when I change this data. This is just some behind-the-scenes data I'm managing here. So I'm storing such an abort controller here. Again, abort controller is a functionality built into modern browsers. And we can assign an abort controller to a request, basically. So here, when we send a request with fetch, we can add a signal property to the configuration object and point at our created abort controller, and there at .signal. This basically links this abort controller to this request. And now we can use this abort controller to cancel this connected request. For this, I will use the useEffect hook here, because useEffect can not just be used to run some logic whenever a component re-renders, but also to clean up or to run some cleanup logic when a component unmounts. And for that, let's say here at the bottom, I will call useEffect here. And my second argument is an empty array. The first argument is a function. And therefore, this only runs when a component mounts. But in this first function, when you return a function, so you return a function in this first function, then this returned function is executed as a cleanup function before the next time useEffect runs again, or also when the component that uses useEffect, so in our case, the component that uses our custom hook, unmounts. So in this cleanup function here, I can then have a look at my active HTTP requests.current property, which is an array of abort controllers in the end. And then with for each, I can go through all these abort controllers, and on every abort controller, I can call abort, and the request to which it is linked will therefore be aborted then. And now that warning which I get here that the value in current will likely have changed by the time this cleanup runs, that is fine for me. I want it to reflect the latest state, so the changed state. I want to go through all abort controllers we registered up to this point. So this is really just some logic added here to make sure that we never continue with a request that is on its way out if we then switch away from the component that triggered the request. This is our finished HTTP hook. Let's now use it in the components we already have. For example, the auth component.